Lord's peace be with you. I'm Pastor Stephen Gjerde here at Zion Lutheran Church, and on behalf of Bethany Lutheran Church, also to share with you some continuing reflections on the book of Proverbs. This is our Sunday morning Bible study here at Zion. And so, as you know, we have been encountering or beginning our book of Proverbs study as part of that, or as that Sunday morning study. The name of the study is Proverbs, Common Wisdom for Uncommon Times. You might even say common sense for uncommon times. We live in some uncommon times. It's not always common that you have so many different stresses and so many different concerns in our society as we have today. Pastor Johnson talked a little bit about that in the introduction to this study 2 weeks ago. And yet we have common wisdom, and it's common wisdom in the sense that it's commonly held by the church. It's commonly held among Christians that this wisdom presented us in Proverbs is part of the way of life. And so last week, Pastor Pinzel spoke with you about wisdom more broadly, looking at different passages in Proverbs regarding wisdom. That is a recurring theme, the recurring language of Proverbs. The goal is to give wisdom, to pass on, in particular, to pass on wisdom from one generation to the next. It is taken for granted in the book, well, maybe not taken for granted, but it's taken as a foundation within the book of Proverbs, that wisdom is passed on primarily from parent to child, from the older generation within a family to the younger generation within a family. We see that persists in our culture down to the present day. Many people have tried to change that over the years. Every now and then you'll have a push against the nuclear family. You have a push against the traditional practice of family as it has been practiced in so many different cultures, with the belief that we can somehow improve upon society by not making it so family-based. But in fact, family keeps coming back. Family is like God. Family isn't God, obviously, but it's like God. There are certain things that God has worked into creation, right? We're told that he creates man and woman in his image. And so, of course, human society will have certain characteristics of God. One is he doesn't go away. God is always there. People, this is the thing about atheism. Atheism is always a defensive posture, right? Atheism is always a defensive posture because the idea of God doesn't depart us. It persists. It's one of the greatest proofs of God's existence. God exists. Why? Well, because he always exists. God exists because he's always there. He's always there in people's minds. He's always there as a part of every culture in some way. And so, to find a truly atheistic culture is very, I don't think it's been done. So it's always there. And so therefore also there's certain features of creation that are there and that persist. Marriage, natural family, and wisdom part of wisdom is learning about those abiding structures of creation as God has created them and worked them into the fabric of the earth. And so one of those is that there's a constant reference to families. Now, the way it does that in Proverbs is by referring to son, because at that time there was a preference for the male children to carry on the wisdom, to be about the task of learning wisdom. There's lots of reasons why that was. I don't think it always pays to sort of sit here 3,000 years later and sit in judgment on it. Because, 3,000 years ago, who knows what exactly it was like. And so today, now also we instruct women as well as men in the councils of the faith. And really they did then too, just in different ways. But that was one of the legacies of the Lutheran Reformation. The Lutheran Reformation insisted on, or really instigated, because it insisted on a well-educated laity. It opened the doors for the education of women as well as men. So the first part of Proverbs, chapters 1 through 9, are really comprised of 9 different addresses to the son, to the child. Let's say the child. It is an address from the parent to this child, from a father to the son. And there's 9 different addresses of these, okay? Which, there's a lot of things to say there. One is that 9 is the, ironically, is the symbolic number of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Of course, she is the mother of our Lord Jesus, and so she also is part of the Holy Family. Interesting that number should, I don't really think it means anything, but it's just interesting. It's a nice way to remember it, that number of the mother of the Holy Family should show up in these addresses of Proverbs within the family. But also, it shows the abiding importance, then, of instruction happening within the family. We see children today always end up doing what they see their parents doing. And if they don't see, even if they don't see their parents doing it because they're separated from their parents, often children will end up doing what they have heard their parents did, or what they have heard their parents are like. It's just there's something very natural in that. Part of wisdom is fitting ourselves to that nature that God has created. So last week, Pastor Pinzel talked about wisdom. This week, I would like to speak with you about hard work. Hard work. Before I do that, I wanted to give you the 9 addresses to the Son, what those chapters and verses are for those of you who may be taking notes. Not a bad idea. Or who have your Bibles in front of you. The very first address to a son speaks about the company of sinners and to avoid it. That is in chapter 1, verses 8 through 19. The second address to a son is chapter 2. The third address to a son is chapter 3, verses 1 to 20. And then the fourth address is chapter 3, verses 21 to 35. The fifth address is chapter 4, verses 10 through 19. But between the fourth and the fifth, there is an address not to the son in the singular, but to sons in general. And that is chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. The sixth address to a son is chapter 4, verses 20 to 27. The seventh address is chapter 5. The eighth address, chapter 6, 1 through 19. And the ninth address is chapter 6, 20 through 35. I'm sorry, there's also a 10th address. That ruins the whole 9 thing. There's a 10th address, and that is chapter 7. So 10 addresses to a son, which makes more sense in Hebrew, in the Hebrew sense of numerology, because 10 becomes much more a play in the number of completion, or in the number of fullness. The number of fullness. 10 becomes significant. So a full address, a full set of instructions to the son. What I'd like to talk with you today about is hard work. How often do we talk about hard work in the church? How often do we talk about how it is that a Christian should work? We know that Jesus worked. He's called a carpenter. In Greek, it is teknon, which could mean carpenter. It could simply mean construction worker. So Jesus was a man engaged in construction work of some kind, as was his guardian Joseph. Most likely he was not engaged in carpentry, like cabinet making and fine furniture building, which is how he is sometimes portrayed in the tradition of the church. Wood was scarce in that region. And so carpentry or construction work was a matter of working with other materials, similar to sort of the adobe that we see in the Southwest United States. But so we know Jesus worked. We know that the Apostle Paul worked. In addition to being an apostle, he was a tent maker, and he sometimes relied on that ability of his to make tents to earn a living for himself. And so hard work is, in fact, we have something for which we have examples already in early Christianity. We have words from the Apostle Paul to the effect that those who don't work should not eat. What he means by that is everyone within the Christian community should find productive labor. And if they don't, they're not contributing. If they don't, then it should be no surprise that they don't eat. He may even have some reference there to the Holy Supper of the church. If someone is being lazy, if someone is not engaged in hard work who could be, perhaps they should not even be admitted to the fellowship of Holy Communion. Now that's something to think about, isn't it? So what does Proverbs have to say about hard work? And why is hard work part of the wisdom of the Christian life? How are we to work? So to start off our reflections, we'll just go somewhat in order. We go to chapter 6. And chapter 6, if you have an ESV, an English Standard Version, it is a chapter that is entitled Practical Warnings. And some of these titles, they're working hard to just come up with something that helps group things together. So there is a whole group of practical warnings in chapter 6, starting at verse 1. I'm going to read verses 1 through 19. So it's a significant passage. This is one of the addresses to a son. My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor, have given your pledge for a stranger, if you are snared in the words of your mouth, caught in the words of your mouth, then do this, my son, and save yourself. For you have come into the hand of your neighbor. Go, hasten, and plead urgently with your neighbor. Give your eyes no sleep, and your eyelids no slumber. Save yourself like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter, like a bird from the hand of the fowler. So that's verses 1 through 5, in which this address to the son begins by saying, don't let yourself be bound, in particular, by debt to others. But also by some sort of arrangement, some sort of promise, some sort of oral contract. If you find yourself bound by oral contract or debt, work hard to free yourself of that. Or as we are told by the Apostle Paul in Romans, in the New Testament, owe no one anything but to love them. That's you could sit with just that statement for a long time. Owe no one anything but to love them. What's so beautiful about that statement is it, first of all, teaches you to avoid debt to the extent that you can. Do everything you can to avoid debt, to avoid being ensnared in contracts that are going to disadvantage you. But at the same time, it does not free us from loving our neighbors or being committed to them, bound to them in that way. Owe no one anything but to love them. There was a pastor friend of mine who he was raising up a pastor for the ministry as we have done here at Zion, and we've done very happily so here at Zion. But in this particular instance, he was raising up this pastor for the ministry, and it turned out towards the end of their time together that this pastor, or this man who's not yet a pastor, he was going to be a pastor, was in fact, the whole time that this church was investing in him to teach him to be a pastor, was in fact feathering his nest in a different occupation, feathering his nest in a different direction, and hid that and absconded that, both from the congregation where he was learning and also from his supervising pastor. And so when that became discovered, of course, the young man felt very embarrassed, was very concerned for his relationship with his mentor and his congregation. So he came to his mentor and he said, you know what I did, and I'm sorry I was doing that. I'm sorry I was leveraging the church essentially in favor of what I really wanted to do. And my friend's response to him was, I thought, really brilliant. You owe me nothing but to love me. You owe me nothing but to love me. That really is profound. And so it allowed that young man it gave him both absolution, forgiveness. You owe me nothing. We were freely giving all this to you. We were not asking for anything back. You owe us nothing but to love us. So yes, it also acknowledged there should have been more respect there, the respect of love. And that opened up a conversation, and they were able to reconcile. So that's how this Proverbs chapter 6 begins, verses 1 through 5, by saying, don't let yourself be ensnared by debt or some other oral agreement that is to your disadvantage. And then it goes on to say, verse 6, go to the ant, O sluggard. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Such powerful, beautiful imagery in the book of Proverbs. But have you ever done that as a child? Do you remember doing that as a child, or perhaps even as an adult, just lying there and looking at the ants and watching the ants? I remember that was fascinating to me as a child, to find an anthill and just to watch how they work. And they are constantly active. They're constantly doing things. He could have said, the author of Proverbs here, if it's King Solomon in particular, he could have said, go look at a toddler. I think toddlers are the same, aren't they? And little children in general. If once a little child wakes up, it is very rare to see a little child act in a lazy manner. They don't always do what you want them to do, perhaps, but they're always doing something. They always have some kind of plan for play or some kind of plan to occupy their times. It's only as people get older, as they move out of that toddler phase into young childhood and young adulthood and older adulthood, that we start talking about being bored. Something my parents never let me say. Just, you can't say that. Don't say I'm bored. If you're bored, it's your responsibility to think of ways to not be bored. Toddlers seem to come by that naturally. Ants come by that naturally. And what the book of Proverbs here is saying is, go to the ant. The ant is an example for you, O humankind. That right there also calls for the virtue of humility and shines some light onto why hard work is part of the way of the Christian. Hard work is part of the way of the Christian because it's built into creation. Just look at the ants. And the Proverbs is saying, you humankind have a connection with the ants. You don't live independently of the ants. Look at the ants and learn from them. We probably could have picked any insect, but the ant is a really good one because they just scatter around, but they're always scattering around for a purpose, right? And so they become our example. And the other point made here then, verse 7, a couple points made here. Verse 7, without having any chief officer or ruler, she, the ant, prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. She doesn't have to be driven to do her work. She's just does it naturally. And Proverbs is saying, let hard work be that natural for you. So how long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, and a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. And see, the problem there, it's saying, is if you find yourself in poverty and want, you're going to end up back at the beginning of the chapter, bound in debt and some kind of oral agreement that will be to your disadvantage. Therefore, work hard to keep yourself free of that. Because if you're free of debt, if you're free of being ensnared by oral contracts and commitments, of owing people things to keep yourself alive, then you're free to pursue virtue. You're free to pursue excellence. You're free to pursue the life God would have you live without the anxiety of having to look over your shoulder at who's coming after you for that debt. So in our day and age, you hear a lot of people talk about freedom from debt, about canceling debt. And what the good in that is that it acknowledges that debt is so destructive. I mean, I've seen marriages ruined by debt. I think we probably all have. I've seen mental health ruined by debt. I've seen physical health ruined by debt. Families broken up. It can be extremely destructive. But the advice of Proverbs, the advice of Holy Scripture, is not to go find someone else to wave a magic wand to free you of debt. the advice of Holy Scripture is avoid debt to begin with, and instead invest in hard work. That may mean that we find ourselves not having what we want immediately, but you'll have something better. You'll have a freedom from being ensnared by debt. And that's what you have to weigh. What's more important to me? What's more important to a happy life? There are many, many happy people who do not have the things for which we usually take out debts. They're happy because they don't have that debt. And so there's part of the wisdom of the Christian then, is to learn to weigh those things and to weigh that to which we really should truly commit ourselves. I have to keep a watch on my time because I do have service again at 11 o'clock, but I think we're still okay for a little bit. Starting again at verse 12 in chapter 6, a worthless person, a wicked man, goes about with crooked speech, winks with his eyes, signals with his feet, like someone playing cards. My grandmother had a cousin who would do that. She would kick people under the table if she had a good hand. Winks with his eyes, signals with his feet, points with his finger, with perverted heart devises evil, continually sowing discord. Therefore calamity will come upon him suddenly. In a moment he will be broken beyond healing. Some people think there's two alternatives to hard work here. One is debt. We've talked about that. The other one is devise evil, devise mischief. I've often met people who think they're going to make a lot of money that way, and who have devoted the better part of their adult life to making money and making a living through evil and mischief and deception. And what has always amazed me is that it always ends up demanding more hard work on their part than just working, right? Because once you say a lie, then you have to keep the lie alive. In order to keep yourself out of further trouble, you keep telling more lies. As Shakespeare says, what a tangled web we weave when we practice to deceive. We get all tangled up in the web of our lies. And not only that, you end up often in trouble with the authorities. You end up having broken relationships. You end up arguing and fighting and defending yourself and running from things. It's more hard work than just having a job. And so, strangely enough, there is freedom in being a worker. And that is common wisdom for uncommon times. In these uncommon times, when people often want to say the freedom is to be found in not working, the Christian perspective is that there is freedom to be found in work. In work, you are freeing yourself from debt. You are freeing for yourself from a life of mischief. And that's a freedom that's worth more than gold, right? That kind of freedom. Now, to move on to another passage about work, hard work in Proverbs, we go to Proverbs chapter 12. And here I want to begin reading. Let me see what my notes said. Here I'll begin reading. I'll just read the whole chapter of chapter 12. Okay, so this is chapter 12 in Proverbs. I'll read the whole chapter. It gives context to everything else. Because often what's being said here is there's a contrast between hard work and then other kinds of living. So when it talks about other ways of living, it's contrasting that with the way of wisdom. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. A good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of evil devices he condemns. No one is established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. The thoughts of the righteous are just, the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright delivers them. The wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. A man is commended according to his good sense, but one of twisted mind is despised. Better to be lowly and have a servant than to play the great man and lack bread. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. Whoever is wicked covets the spoil of evildoers, but the root of the righteous bears fruit. An evil man is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous escapes from trouble. From the fruit of his mouth a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hand comes back to him. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. The vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. Whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. There is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but those who plan peace have joy. No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaims folly. The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful, the lazy, will be put to forced labor. Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad. One who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will beget precious wealth. In the path of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. Listen to that chapter. I should have said this before I read it, but you can go back and read it again. Listen to this chapter and reflect on what it says in terms of how to behave as an employee or as a worker at any institution. It gives a full list of how to behave well, whether you're working retail or serving in a profession or farming and dealing with agricultural business, whatever it is you may be doing. Listen to what this has to say. Whoever loves right off the bat, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. In other words, I mean, it's very strong words, right? In other words, open yourself up to being corrected. Open yourself up to being disciplined, to hearing a word that has something to say to you, because that will help you gain knowledge. That will help you learn. Even if you decide, and this is an art, I think. Even if the art of sifting through feedback and learning when to set some feedback aside and say, I'm not going to listen to that. Even that process of sifting feedback and determining that some feedback is not fair or some feedback is not helpful, is not practical, is not wise, that is a learning moment, right? So we open ourselves up to feedback. We want to hear feedback, even if we throw some of it out, because it always helps us improve in our labors. And then it goes on to say, it's interesting. It throws in there this comment about a wife. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. I don't know if this really immediately connects, but it is, I think, true that when it comes to working well or working hard, if we have a relationship, if we're married or part of a family in some other way, it's important that we seek to connect that labor with our whole family so that we may be supported in our work by our family and so that our work also serves our family. Our work does not exist in a vacuum for us individually to be satisfied and fulfilled. There is some dimension to my work as a pastor, which is for the sake of the gospel and therefore very altruistic, something that I am bound and obligated to do even if I'm not paid for it, right? There is nevertheless some aspect of this vocation to which I've been called that is in service of my family as well. As Paul says, even though we're obligated to preach the gospel even if we're not paid, Paul says the cow deserves his grain. In essence, the cow of the pastor deserves the grain of his recompense, of his compensation, I should say. And so that is partly in service of my family. So people sometimes think of the church as a very holy calling, and it is a holy calling. Part of its holiness is that it serves a family. So it goes also for working retail, being a dental hygienist, being an accountant, being a musician. I'm looking at the people who are watching. Whatever you may be in, It's holy labor, and it's something in service of your household, and therefore something you want to help your household support and appreciate. It's something that your household should respect. Then we have a couple other, important things said here for workers. Better to be lowly and have a servant than to play the great man and lack bread. Better to come in with humility and say, I don't know what I'm doing at some instance, rather than to pretend that you do know and do the job poorly and end up lacking bread. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Who was it who said you can tell who a man is by how he treats his horse? Somebody said that. Mark Twain gets credited for everything like that, but I don't think he's the one who said it. You can tell how a man is, what kind of a man he is, by how he treats his horse. That's what this is saying. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. So in the conduct of your work, even those who are less than you, whether it be an instrument, a tool, a computer, respect the instruments, respect the tools, treat them well. Or if it's someone who is lower on the totem pole than you at work, treat them well. Treat them with respect. Even if you're going to fire them, treat them with respect. Certainly animals, other things that are engaged in your work. Better to approach them even in this way that shows them respect. There's wisdom in that that's good, helpful for hard work. I'm going to check my time to make sure that I don't neglect my service coming up at 11. I'll be right back. So I really should go and conclude this. This has been fun. I could talk a lot more about this because hard work is so very important. And it's something that is not talked a lot about in the church. It should be. It needs to be talked about a lot more because this is common wisdom for these uncommon times. Please join us again then next week as we continue to explore this topic. The Lord's peace be with you.